Thanks for joining us for this session. We'll focus on sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, as well as the SAF registry. And today with me, I have Hemant Mistry, who's Director of Net Zero Transition, Priti Jain, who's the Head of Net Zero Research and Programs, and Michael Schneider, who's Associate Director for Sustainability Programs. Hemant, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nico, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us again this morning. So, we've talked a lot about sustainable aviation fuels in previous meetings that we've had, and you recall in Dubai for the AGM, we did present an outlook in terms of where we were with sustainable aviation fuel, and there we did raise some concerns. We had some issues, we foresaw some issues in terms of SAF output. And today what we'd like to do is to provide you with an update of where we see the industry is for 2024. So end of the year, what is the actual status in terms of SAF production? We'll also provide you with an outlook for 2030 as well. But we do also want to spend some time to present to you one of the key facilitators for SAF going forward, which is going to be the SAF registry. So we'd like to talk you through that. And then finally, we want to put the progress, or even the lack thereof in some cases, in the context of the overall transition. So that's the context of the presentation today. What I'd like to do is to hand over to Priti Jain. Now, Priti is the head of Net Zero Research and Programs, and she and her team have been responsible for a lot of the work which will be presented in the first part of this presentation. So Priti, over to you.
Very good morning to all of you. Before we get into the journey to understand production of SAF, I must say we are in that part of the year where it's time to reflect and strategize. And in that reflection, it's a right thing to ask the question that are we progressing towards SAF, one of the biggest levers to deliver sustainability and help industry reach 2050 objectives. There are a number of complexities, but at the same time, there are a number of optimism. Let's navigate that journey together. Before we get into the production landscape this year and next, we are discussing this because we look climate change and energy transition as two imperative, which industry has to undertake and go through the journey. But when you look at the aviation, I must say that transition is not new to this industry. You all have been, in this room and witnessed that how technology and fuel quality transition has happened in this industry over the last 70 years, from aviation gasoline to jet kerosene, from minimal volume of jet kerosenes at the refinery to 7% of the product share today. In fact, today we see a benchmark when it comes to technology as well as fuel quality. When it comes to SAF, we have to go through a similar journey, but the journey will be spread not over 70 years, but 25 years. And to make that happen, ICAO and different nations, as well as industry, we have a clarion call that how we meet 2050 net zero target. So how SAF looks in this overall big picture? Let's see that progress together. When we look at the big picture, there are a number of studies out there which look into the SAF projection assessment. There are studies which estimates and take into consideration of 150 to 300 projects for the SAF, and these projects have been mapped under various studies. At IATA, we have mapped around 220 projects spread around the globe. What makes us different that out of 220 projects, we have considered only 158 identified renewable fuel capacity that have explicitly mentioned either SAF capability or intent to produce SAF. What makes us further, stand out among all of these studies is the effort to validate and authenticate these numbers by direct engagement to a multiple project developers, which we have considered in terms of our capacity estimations. And we see these 158 projects cumulatively account to around 51 million ton of renewable fuel capacity, where we see that 20 projects currently are operating. But at the same time, I must underline that around 100 projects are still at the announced or very early stages, indicating we need more policy support so that these projects move forward, and rest of the projects are either in the construction stage or at pilot or demo scale. HEFA is, yes, clearly a key pathway, which I will discuss in the subsequent slide. I must also share that we see that how policies have shaped development of these projects, because nearly 60% of these projects are either located together, collectively are located in US and Europe. Let's look at these projects year-wise and how the cumulative capacity is growing from now till 2030 in terms of the total capacity, as well as in terms of technology diversification. As an industry association, we do believe that SAF success can be built on the technology diversification as well as feedstock diversification. But the question comes, is that happening? Let's see. When we look at this slide, each bar you see on this slide is showing you cumulative capacity of renewable fuel capacity, which is developing around the world. And we see by 2030, as I shared in my previous slide, it will be 51 million ton. But the blue color, which shows that HEFA pathways, which utilize lipids and oil feedstock, is going to be a predominant pathway that doesn't leave us with the requirement that we need technology diversification. But at the same time, I must highlight, it also calls for feedstock rationalization for hard-to-abate sector like aviation, because we don't have any other choice. Till the time other technology matures, feedstock rationalization is important. Next come role of alcohol to jet. And we see 2027 onwards, ethanol to jet will also play an important role, but subject to realization of the capacity. Tremendous feedstock potential like biomass or CO2, which can be captured from industrial sources, can find its way through pathways like Fischer-Tropsch as power to liquid, which I will share further in my next slides. But we see technology maturity, scale up, and cost are biggest hindrances. So where does it leave us? It leaves us at the cumulative capacity of around 9 million ton and 18 million ton for 2024 and 25. And you will see this capacity is again lower from last year because of our stricter project inclusion criteria. We made sure that projects which are really moving forward are being considered in our assessment. So where do we stand today in terms of the SAF production? I must say it's a bit disappointing to see that SAF production numbers are not able to reach the last year estimates of 1.5 million ton, which we thought, because of different policy drivers, we can find that kind of production. But we are standing only at 1 million ton, less than 1% share of sustainable aviation fuel in the commercial aviation fuel basket. And going forward also, next year, yes, there is a positive side. We see this 1 million ton production to be doubled, reaching around 2 million ton, but still it will not be reaching 1% of conventional fuel share. So making a big gap in the expected SAF supply, which is required, and the current production estimate. I would also like to draw your attention on the lowest line in this slide, which shows SAF percentage share from total renewable fuel capacity, which is essentially SAF production divided by total renewable fuel capacity. And if you feel happy immediately looking at the number of 11% and 13%, I will request you, please hold your thoughts for a moment, because this increase in SAF share in the renewable fuel capacity is not because that these projects are producing more SAF, but because of our stricter project inclusion criteria, thus reducing the base of renewable fuel capacity which we have considered. So SAF is not moving as anticipated. But what was policy's aspirations? How the airline industry is committed? So let's look at the policy side of it first. Policy, which is both carrot and stick approach, we see around the world in terms of incentives, in terms of mandate, cumulatively calls for around 17 million ton of production volumes that will be made available by 2030. This is, by the way, aspiration. And in the previous slide, I just showed you that in 24, we stand at around 1 million ton. So even if we have to reach 17 million ton, there is a huge gap, clearly indicating things are not working as anticipated. On the other side, when I see airlines' commitment, which is pretty impressive, looks like perfect harmony between the policy direction as well as the offtake commitment. And 70% of these offtake commitments, I must underline, are binding in their nature. And as an airline industry, we are committed in the diversification of these SAF pathways and technologies. So not only these binding agreements are for HEFA, but they are also for the new technology pathways like Fischer-Tropsch, PTL, as well as alcohol to jet. So definitely industry is making an effort how we help in each and every possible manner to scale up SAF. Technology diversification and feedstock diversification, as I mentioned, are essential pillars. But when we look regions and spread of 51 million ton capacity in terms of technology and feedstock, we see there is not enough progress happening, and there is a contrast around the world, both on a positive side as well as not so positive side. Let's look at the not so positive side. Africa. I think all of you always hear, that Africa has a tremendous potential, but we see that potential is not getting channelized. So it's a definitely call to multi-stakeholders, energy companies, government, that how we make sure that can be harnessed and channelized. When it comes to Asia, we see the missing supply chains are not leading to the more SAF projects, and existing SAF projects are primarily HEFA-based, and some new capacity is likely to be alcohol to jet. And if till the time we won't have more incentives, technology to these regions, we won't see many of SAF projects. Americas, on the other side, the policies are making emphasis that they expand from the HEFA capacity base to alcohol to jet and Fischer-Tropsch, and thus you can see in this pie chart over Americas, the color apart from blue is also yellow and red. But the most interesting pie chart which stands in this slide is one for Europe. And you will see most of the colors are there in Europe, indicating that incentives or grant are definitely allowing diversification of different technologies and pathways. But can it lead to SAF production volume? And when we try to find that answer, we see that many of these projects are still at pilot and demo stage, so much far away from the reality to make those production available on the ground and available to the airlines. We also further slice the pink part of this pie chart, which is PTL projects, and ask this question to ourselves: can PTL be a game changer? We see mandates are the key drivers for PTL and PTL projects. And when we try to look into the policy as well as PTL capacity around the world, including Europe, because around more than 70% of these projects are in Europe. If you look at the yellow color, which is basically driven by policy mandates, how much of SAF volume capacity will be required. And we look at the blue color, which is basically showing how much of capacity has been announced to meet the requirement. Looks like a perfect symphony that policy is giving you mandate and these much of SAF volumes will be available. But that's not the reality of these projects showed us. When we looked into these projects with much more, granularity, we found that 70% of these projects are just announcement. And out of 70 projects, 15 projects have already been canceled. Given the fact that PTL technology has a potential and it can unlock bio-feedstock limitations, but the technology challenges, the scale of technology, the capex requirement, as well as maturity are the key factors, and we feel despite having mandates, there is a clear risk. And as an industry, we need to have more policy enablers to make this happen. And before I hand over to my colleague, I must underline the importance of policy sequencing, which we have been telling time and again, that you need incentives first to create a functional market, to make these volumes available before we start thinking about mandate. So with that, I will stop here and hand over back to Hemant.
Thank you, Priti. And so that was, I think, an excellent review in terms of the current status for SAF production. Some of the challenges we have. By the way, PTL is power to liquid, or otherwise known as e-fuels, just in case someone missed that. So, you know, we're looking at all of these challenges, and from our perspective as IATA, representing over 330 member airlines, we're trying to do everything we can to make sure that airlines, our members, are able to source, to purchase, and account for SAF. And that's one of the key roles that we can actually execute across the world. So we've developed a SAF model contract, so the suppliers and airlines can have a basis for negotiating SAF supply. We've been training our members across the globe so that everyone has a proficiency on SAF. We've developed guidelines on SAF sustainability documentation so that the environmental attributes can be transferred from the producer down the supply chain to the actual purchaser as well. And we've got detailed guidelines and manuals in terms of compliance with regulations such as CORSIA and refuels. So we're trying to do all of these things. And very importantly, we're also now in the process of rolling out a global SAF accounting platform. This is what we're calling the SAF Registry. Now, you're going to hear more about that in a second, but this is really for application across all regions, across all airlines, so that everyone has access to SAF production and can utilize production where it's best fit. And that's really important for us, particularly if we're going to scale up the market. And this will be complemented by the Matchmaker. Some of you may have seen announcements on the Matchmaker. That's really a service where the airlines and suppliers can contact each other when they have an actual interest to purchase or to sell SAF. And we also want to digitalize the use of SAF as well. So we want to expand the fuel data standards to include SAF. So these are some of the components, but also working on specific projects. We're working on bringing together the technology providers, the feedstock developers, governments, and financiers into specific projects so that we can start to boost projects, particularly in developing nations and developing regions. That's really important. And finally, earlier this year, we rolled out what we call Track Zero, so we're able to track the progress across member airlines in terms of net zero. So I'd want to go back and maybe give Michael an opportunity to describe the SAF registry in more detail, because this is really a very important facilitator for us in terms of SAF rollout. So Michael?
Thank you, Hemant. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to talk about the SAF registry. Certainly very close to my heart, but not only to my heart, because this is a very strategically important project for IATA. I would consider this as one of the flagship projects. And for good reasons. I think we heard from Priti very well the importance of SAF as being one of the primary levers for us to reach decarbonization. Reality is SAF is not available in all parts of the world. Something we saw some pockets where SAF maybe is more prevalent than in other parts. But I think it makes sense to use SAF where it's being produced, or to closest where it's being produced. And it does not make sense to really ship around SAF around the world. First of all, from the cost point of view, but also from the point of creating additional emissions by shipping basically SAF from one part of the world to another. So this makes sense for approach that we call book and claim, and the use of a registry where we, by means of certificates, make this an accounting exercise. And I know this concept of book and claim is not an easy one to convey. But let me give you two examples, and maybe one example that is more relatable for everyone that has a house that pays an electricity bill, and it's something that's actually, book and claim is an approach that is being used in the electricity market for many, many years. When you get your electricity bill, you can opt in many cases, in many countries, that you pay a green premium or for green electricity that could stem from hydro or from solar. And what really happens in the background is that the green electrons actually never arrive at your house, because the electricity provider buys certificate from the renewable energy market. And those certificates are being accounted for, and of course you pay a premium, you pay a little extra that basically finance those certificates. And so this whole exercise becomes an accounting exercise. That's actually not so different in the case of aviation, and I give you an aviation example obviously here. Let's assume you have a fuel supplier based in California that provides SAF into San Francisco airport. So SAF molecules are commingled in the hydrogen system of San Francisco airport, and you have an airline or airline operator based in Johannesburg with no access to physical SAF. This airline will still be able, by means of booking claim, to engage with the supplier in California, negotiate a contract. Let's assume the contract has been concluded. By means of SAF certificates that are immutable, that are based on something that's called the proof of sustainability, you can dislodge, you can disconnect the environmental attributes, meaning the benefit of that SAF, the CO2 reduction, you can basically decouple that, and you can transfer this via a certificate and a registry to the airline in question. So that allows really for this airline to make a claim, a CO2 reduction claim, without actually having the physical use of that SAF. What happens at the airport, where in San Francisco, basically the SAF was supplied, airlines that are uplifting some of those SAF molecules by generic uplift, because they're commingled with conventional fuels, those airlines cannot make any claims. So this SAF that is being uplifted basically is becoming conventional fuel. So the SAF registry should basically also ensure that there is no double counting of those attributes, those benefits of a given SAF batch. This approach and the registry, so coupled, basically also achieve a cost reduction, because obviously the transportation, the logistical exercise, the transacting itself will of course be diminished or reduced, and obviously there is a cost aspect that is very interesting, and also the administrative burden of procuring SAF. Another area we heard from pretty very clearly, there is more and more regulatory frameworks that emerge in Europe, in other parts of the world. We have Corry. So airlines facing basically the task of meeting their obligation, and this can be very complex to fulfill. And here, the IATA SAF registry, and I give you here a little snippet, a screenshot of what has been developed so far. This system will actually exactly do what I described. It allows the decoupling of the environmental attributes and to store the information in an immutable way. So the system can upload what is called the proof of sustainability, which is a certified document. It captures 100+ data items from the feedstock that's been used, the production process, the life cycle emission, all the important information, and allows it then, after the validation and acceptance within the system, to be transferred from one party to another, from the fuel supplier to the airline, for example. It also allows the claiming under the regulatory frameworks, and here very important, we are working very closely with governments, state authorities, ICAO, the EU Commission, to understand what is it we can bring in front of them, how can we pair those state authorities with the airlines within the system, so that they can validate or accept claim directly, and this would, of course, greatly help with the administrative burden. And again, it can reduce some of the cost. And here you see the typical users of such a system, so the key actors that would be accessing the system. That's the SAF producers, the fuel suppliers that obviously interact with the airlines that procuring the fuel. And then, of course, we have the end customers. We have freight forwarders, shippers, we have corporates. In the case of a corporate, let's say I'm a large corporate that has a specific transport activity with an airline. I would like to reduce my carbon footprint from business travel. Then, in this case, the system also facilitates the co-financing of the SAF, where the corporate makes an investment to reduce their own carbon emissions from the transport activity, and the airline can submit within the system to the corporate, again, a certificate that allows them to make a claim under any reporting initiative that maybe the corporate takes part. So this is a very crucial and important mechanism also for the airlines to work with their customers and help them to substantiate any emission reductions. And then you see, of course, sort of on the vertical level, the type of regulatory mechanism airlines and also fuel suppliers facing. In the case of airlines, of course, CORSIA, you can reduce your offsetting obligation by use of SAF. So there could be a direct link with the state authority to do that. There's the EU ETS, where airlines facing obligations. And on the fuel supplier side, there are mandates, for example, in France or in Europe, where the system can help them to substantiate that they're actually meeting the mandate. So very important when we started this project that we had on board all those important stakeholders to help us develop the system and to get their support. And we have a great number of early adopters, which I think it's really, really positive news for the industry. Obviously, our members are fully behind this initiative. We certainly work with the major producers, and every time I show this slide, it's already outdated because we have more organizations, airlines joining this program. But also, of course, very important, the states. And here again, we're not only working with 6 states. In fact, we are discussing with those states that are contemplating of joining. We're discussing with the EU Commission. We're discussing with ICAOs to progress this and to make it a system that is robust and accepted by the authorities and by everyone using it. And maybe the last slide, where are we standing with this project? So when we started back in December 2023, when the project was approved, we started, no, I wouldn't say exactly with a blank page, but we of course needed to very well understand what is it we need to build here, what is it we can put in front of, for example, governments in terms of data, what are the inputs, outputs. So we had 100+ sessions with different stakeholders to gather all the requirements, functionalities. We are in full swing with the development. In fact, I'm very proud to say that yesterday and today we had our pilot session with those partners that you saw on the screen to already validate what has been developed. Is it meeting the requirement, fit for purpose? And we, of course, looking very much forward to its launch in April 2025. I'm very much convinced this is really a game changer for the industry, extremely important project. And of course, we can only thank all those organizations that help us to release or to develop this mechanism. With this, I'm handing back to Hemant.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So a really important activity for us, and I'm sure you'll be tracking that in terms of the my milestones you see there. Minimum product launch, April, and then release in June. So a very important facilitator for SAF going forward, particularly in terms of trying to make sure that we can use global production, global feedstock, and understand how best we can utilize the use of SAF across the airline industry. Let me go back and reiterate how important SAF is, of course, in our journey, and SAF production and availability, because we need to ramp up. And when we look here in terms of the roadmap, which we have previously released, and other roadmaps show a similar story, each roadmap always declares SAF is the biggest lever. That's a given. And for us, what we're looking at is by 2050, we're looking at SAF to replace the use of fossil fuel by almost 90%. And there you can see the combination between power to liquid and biomass solutions. We still have some remnant use of conventional fuel, 6%, and then a steady ramp up for hydrogen solutions at 6% as well. And of course, we'd have to use carbon removals to capture any residual emissions. I wanted to show that because SAF is so fundamental to our story. But when we look at the overall transition costing, and you will maybe have realized that we've done a detailed analysis in terms of the financing aspects. And by the way, there is later on a deep dive session in terms of our work on financing and policy, which is at 1 o'clock, and I do encourage you all to join that. But we've looked at the cost of that transition. So we've looked at the cost of the incremental cost of SAF compared to conventional fuel, according to our forecast, the cost of CORSIA offsets, the cost of using hydrogen on new aircraft, the cost of carbon removals, and we look at that as a transition cost for airlines. And that equates, according to our analysis, to 4.7 trillion. But to actually even enable that transition, you need to have the biggest lever available in terms of production, which is SAF. So if we look at the CapEx that's required for SAF, we're looking, first of all, we need to step back, because let's not forget, this is not just SAF units, they're renewable fuel refineries. So they produce different products for different solutions. And once again, just to reiterate what Priti was saying, it's not an aviation-only journey. This is a multi-sector solution journey. So what we're trying to create here, and governments need to understand that, is it's not just about aviation, it's about providing solutions for other users, including renewable diesel and different transport modes as well. But we can foresee that we would need overall, between 3,000 and over 6,500 renewable fuel plants for those multi-product solutions. And to finance that in terms of CapEx, that's going to range between 4 to 8 trillion. Again, this is not all for SAF, it's very important to remember, this is for the range of product that comes out from the renewable fuel facilities. There is opportunities to use existing refining infrastructure through a process called co-processing. That's where you can provide an input for the intermediate bio-oils into the existing refining infrastructure within limits, but you can kickstart that transition with availability of SAF using existing infrastructure with some smaller modification to infrastructure. So this is a great opportunity. And I think, we would like to leave you with 3 main takeaways. When we look at this, we do have challenges in terms of SAF output. We all want to see more SAF output. 3 things which we encourage the broader industry to capitalize on. One is to utilize co-processing to the maximum extent possible, particularly during these early years. Very important. Secondly, we need policies that support the maximization of SAF output from the renewable fuel refineries. You remember the variance I showed in terms of the actual costs and number of renewable fuel plants. So that is one thing as well. That's the second point. The third point I do want to emphasize, and that is that the traditional energy companies, the integrated oil companies, they have a much larger role to play in all of this. They have the access to capital. They have the skills to de-risk these renewable fuel projects. This is what they've been doing. They have a lot of project management experience. They have quality assurance experience. They can do this in a much easier way, but we need them to come to the table. They need now to start to get more involved in this energy transition, because it's only with their help that we're going to be able to create more of a functioning market for SAF. And it's not, right now what we're seeing is some of the big energy companies are just trying to meet the mandate. That is not acceptable. We need them to come into this fold and to help create a functioning market.